So I'm going to shift the conversation in two different ways. The first one is to say, okay, so we're getting into the big questions of this. How do we facilitate it? This is the strategy of the PMA. What are the problems y'all anticipate or have already found in facilitating the PMAs with this being the goal? And let's just list them up, just rattle them off.
What's the goal?
Staying on topic?
Okay.
The big problems facilitating the PMA if the strategy is to build towards power.
Oh.
Staying on topic. What else? Just shout them out. Let's just
Personal
go.
attacks.
Personal attacks. These might just, yeah, go ahead. What else?
Lack of facilitation skills.
Lack of skills.
Overwhelming issues.
Great.
Putting an organization's needs above the need of the movement as a whole.
I knew this was going to be the right way to go.
In fact, we might want to put that PMA relationship to existing organizations, because I think
Great.
whoever said this over here, like, boy, that's one.
Existing organizations and formations. But wait, let me get them all going here. Overwhelming issues, and Rita, say it again.
Putting
Your organization above the movement.
Thank you.
Putting the movement's needs.
Putting the organizational needs above the needs of the movement.
As a challenge.
Self-serving agenda is turf battle.
Turf, right? It's turf, it's ideologies, right? It's funding. Just straight up competition. For
Ego.
Self-serving agendas.
Self-serving agendas, right? Self-serving. Great.
Stuck in reactions.
Reactive. That's another big problem. Sorry, it's on a roll. Stuck in reaction. That's right. What other big problems come up facilitating?
That it's used as a technique rather than a process. Because there's a lot of facilitation that's purely technical approach and doesn't go into the developing process.
Right.
And since it's new, how to execute it.
Say again.
Since it's a new thing,
How do we execute?
How do we execute it?
Great. That's this question on the table. Other big problems that people come into contact into with, or
Preset agendas, it doesn't feel like you can come into it.
preset agendas,
Yeah, there's no entry point for community members.
lack of entry points. George.
I don't quite know how to say it, but not getting people to really own it. You know, like they're spectators, or they're just passing through. You know.
Great. So if we're calling this a participatory process, that means people have to participate. But we've been trained not to. We've been trained to come in, be an audience, and then critique everything that's in front of us. Generally, especially as activists or organizers or both. So how do folks want to participate, and what is that going to take before the PMA even starts? So this is a great list. It's just a beginning of all the kinds of group facilitation process problems that we have. It's not just related to the PMA, but to every time we get together as a group. So these are classic organizing questions. The opportunity here is to tackle them from a new perspective, and potentially with a new model. So the first assumption that I'm going to put out there, and we're going to continue talking about, is that facilitation is not neutral. Facilitation is not a neutral person in the room. The goals, the purpose, the methods of the facilitator are not neutral. So that's the assumption we're going to start with. Yeah.
Is that in the PMA process or in general?
Well, we're going to stay inside the PMA context. I would say it for most spaces. There can be a way to be more and more, edge on to neutral if you need to be, but that's what we're going to kind of talk about right now. I'm going to throw some pieces out there and see where it goes.
Just to clarify the question, when you say in the process, are you talking about the actual event or the organizing process?
That goes back to my question about opening spaces.
That was the segue so long ago, but it was PMA relationship to open space and does it expire. So we don't consider, I think when Ruben was putting out open space, the open space is a methodology for this social forum. The movement assembly process emerged as a way to have, when we come together, it's not neutral. Our conditions are not neutral. We're not up against, these attacks aren't neutral. They're coming up against us in particular ways. How do we turn around and face it, move and advance in terms of our own visions and strategies and so forth, right? So that's why facilitation, we say, shouldn't be neutral in terms of the PMA, because this is what we're trying to do. If we're just trying to come together and have a good time, it can be neutral. But if we're trying to come together and build social movement power, construct plans for governance, that's not neutral. So we need to be prepared. So one of the biggest the principles that we use in terms of facilitation is preparation. And that means not just agenda and flow, but who you've talked to and worked with that's going to be joining this process. So there's relatively few people that are going to be coming into a PMA that have no idea what it is. That preparation should be part of the organizing process. Facilitation is not just from that 2 o'clock to 5 p.m. It's the whole process about the preparation, how people have been talked to about it, how people have been brought in, and so forth. So in thinking about the purpose of facilitation, if it's not neutral, I'm going to offer 3 different things that it does. 1, it's content-driven. There's a facilitation that's specifically content-driven to share, learn, build knowledge, build skills. That's a kind of facilitation. There's a kind of facilitation that's process-driven, to build relationships, to build teams, to build analysis even. There's a process to build analysis. Either you're sharing what just happened in your hometown, you're sharing the difficulties around water, you're sharing this and so that people can learn and understand better, that's content. But to develop an analysis of why all of our communities are facing water fights, that would be in process. And the third is decision-driven facilitation. These are 3 different skill sets. And so we should think about, and I think be aware of, as we're crafting PMAs and assemblies that are bringing in new folks that are excited to work, that are bringing in other organizers that are maybe cynical, and maybe have been in a lot of meetings and need to get the juice back, we need to be thinking about how we're facilitating these spaces. And what kind, and then ways that we use it. Because I think probably most assemblies, if done really well, will probably use all 3. So we need to make those distinctions. That's purpose, and deciding what the purpose is. The next piece I'm going to say is the political guidelines. If it's not neutral, then what are the guidelines that you're using to move it forward? I'm not going to say that there's a whole list of guidelines that we're using for PMAs. We've used some that work. We're going to actually look at some of the different PMAs that have happened and see which ones work in terms of guidelines. But we need them. I'm just going to say we need them. As a facilitative process, as facilitative leadership, what are the political guidelines that we're talking about? One way that we talk about that is around seeking out the context of the thing. We're not just talking about healthcare in 2010 or 2011. We're talking about the system of healthcare as it has evolved over the last 2 centuries in the U.S. and across the world. How are y'all going to talk about that in the PMA? Where is the historic context? Where is the political context? How are y'all delivering that? Or how are you pulling it from the room itself? Question, right? That we're trying, one of the political guidelines to me is go beyond the laundry list. That we're not just listing the problems. How do we connect analysis building to action-based decision-making? That's a guideline that we're going to have to move the room to think through analysis and then move towards action-based work in a few hours. And that's why the prep's so important. And the follow-through's got to be prepared beforehand. And then seeking out strategic directions. If that's a political guideline, that's what we tried to use with the assemblies in Detroit. Seek out where we can hit first. Not just the vision 20 steps out, but that vision and then the first 5 steps, based on our position now. That's a different question that we have to enfold into a popular process. Difficult. The third big piece that I would say is the principles themselves, and y'all started to name a bunch. So to say inclusivity is cool, but how do we name that as a principle? But then what does it mean? Does it mean everybody gets the same amount of time to speak? Like we could go super rigid on it? Or it could be that we've developed a way for everybody to get their voice out there in a productive way. How do we do it? But what are the principles that we're using? This again, we're not going to give a list of principles. We have some that we've been using. We think rigor is going to be necessary to have a relationship to conflict and disagreement. We're going to have some kind of political rigor around how we have these conversations, so they don't just, it's not just agree to disagree. We've been agreeing to disagree for a long time. So how do we actually come to some debate without it throwing off the process completely? To me, rigor is a principle. Imagination is a principle. How do we actually create a space that expands the possibilities? Because if we know we're not living in the place where we want to live, we're imagining way beyond that thing. And I think we were able to do a little bit of that in some of these different spaces. The PMA process allowed that space to get big. And then how do we follow up on it is the big question after. It doesn't mean getting big was bad, but it does mean we have to think through how to follow through on that big, right? And one principle might be that there's no wrong information. That when we come together as a group and try to move this process forward, we're going to be getting a ton of information. All this information is really, really good. This is not stuff that we can throw away. We are stuck in reaction for a reason. It's designed to keep us there. The system is designed to keep us there. We can go investigate each of these things. Overwhelming issues? Hell yeah. On a big picture and just in our bodies. This is overwhelming just to me. In our own bodies, in our own daily lives. These are real things. There's information here in what's the problem. So we can investigate that and build principles around them. Use these. Use these as your facilitation guides, right? And then the last thing is style and technique we talk about. And this is the last thing that has been said. You don't start here. You don't start with the technicalities of facilitation. That's not where we started today. We started back in the 60s and what models of liberation were used. We started with a context. We started with history. We started with those pieces, right? This is last. But it is a piece. And developing your technique and then developing your own style with it is going to be dependent on the different groups you're moving. It's going to look really different to move young people across the South into a PMA process in Birmingham at a big conference than it is even just to move 600 people talking about poverty even just in this space. Similar folks, they might even be related. Those are two different processes. Those are two different processes and we have to have different styles. And we're going to have different kinds of cultural inspiration and pieces in there. We're going to have to let people come up with that themselves. How do we evolve the process so that it matches what's happening? How are there different levels of PMAs? Maybe there's one huge big one, and then lots of small ones that break off. Maybe there's lots of small ones that build up to one huge, large one that everybody's prepared to walk into and really be productive because they've had some practice, they've run their own. So they're actually patient with the facilitator that's kind of losing the room, and they can actually step in and help, right? Or they can say, I'll do this small group over here, because I've already ran an entire PMA back at home. So this emerges as we go.
And there I think at the bottom of that is the whole theory of learning. Because if we are repeating that you have an active teacher and then passive participants, then we're still in the I'm the teacher, you're the student kind of paradigm. We want to change that because everybody's in the same place, in the same level, and ought to participate equally. Not necessarily equally in time and all that, but equally in space, in right. And so we can't advance if we keep repeating the old stuff and not break through, because then it shows that we don't have faith in the masses, that they don't know, and yet they're the ones who know. We need to collectivize that, collect that knowledge so that we can reflect on it. And that style and technique is about getting that there.
So when we say, yeah, that one of the other assumptions, I guess, that we could say, that facilitation is not neutral, and that this process is about learning, and this process is about building towards action, and those are in concert. So that's a kind of popular education that's also not neutral. That's a strategy towards action.